to a better understanding of this problem of infodemiology. What I would like to do is maybe explain also some of the work that we've done in this area that will give starting points for further discussion. I think some of what I have to say will hopefully also resonate with some of the points made in the pre-conference yesterday and also earlier today around things like that we have to meet individuals and communities where they are, try and understand their fears and engage rather than shame them. I think these are really interesting themes that have come up in our discussion so far. So we can look at the first slide there. And this is really South African examples that I've put up there to do with the first initial responses after the first case of COVID-19 was confirmed in South Africa. Just as soon as the first case was confirmed, the jokes started. There were memes featuring prominent politicians, bad puns, TikTok videos, clips of pictures posing with silly homemade protective gear that you can see there. And so from this, in South Africa, immediately the response was to make fun of the virus. And it's not unusual for South Africans to make jokes about their many problems, from corruption to power blackouts, and cartoonists never have a shortage of material. And of course, online jokes and memes and video clips are also not peculiar to South Africa. But it is remarkable, I think, how in a country like South Africa and some other African countries with our multitude of serious challenges, media users often take to jokes rather than despair when they are presented with a new problem. And in the history of African humor and satire, we can also see how this has been used for progressive ends, to undermine oppressive political power, for instance, and to debunk misleading authoritarian narratives. But unfortunately, within this context, the prevalence of jokes and satire can also lead to the spread of misinformation, and audiences don't always know what information to trust and what to just laugh about. So while joking about the coronavirus might be an indication of people's social resilience in the wake of massive challenges, they could also help us provide a sense of what the shared fears and anxieties were around this issue. But in this mix, I think, of satire and humor, it also opens the way for misinformation to emerge, and we have to be cautious about that as well. So I think it's very important that we take these jokes seriously. And why? Because the infodemic doesn't spread in thin air, nor does it spread in the same way around the world. To contain and mitigate the virus of misinformation, to continue that metaphor, and I think the metaphor maybe has some limitations, but I think to continue that notion of containing and mitigating misinformation, we need to understand the conditions that allow this virus to flourish, this virus of misinformation. So even a humorous response like the ones that we've seen in South Africa, I think gives us clues of what the dominant narratives are, what people's fears and anxieties are. And I think this is the point really that I want to make also in this talk, is that only when we understand people's lived experience, their cultural practices, their social histories, their economic and political environments, only when we have a good understanding of that, or an immersive understanding of those contexts, will we be able to design more appropriate interventions. And I think this is where media and cultural studies come in, and where this field of media and cultural studies can make a useful contribution. So if we go to the next slide there, it's just a picture of I think a sort of a classic in the media and cultural studies literature, that of the circuit of culture. So if we consider misinformation within this broader context of infodemiology, we acknowledge that information does not circulate in a vacuum. We need to analyze the infodemic not only as a technological, but as a multi-level, complex, and evolving socio-cultural phenomenon. So we cannot just try to counter misinformation in isolation by correcting and countering it with more facts. That correction is important, the fact-checking is important, but I think for a sustained counter to this problem, we have to understand the social dynamics and the material circumstances within which this misinformation spreads. Just like a virus needs a host environment, misinformation needs a particular context, and it is transferred between people with particular identities, histories, and cultures, and it's constrained or amplified by particular media systems and regulatory policies. So to analyze multi-level socio-cultural phenomena, we need multi-level socio-cultural approaches and methods. And this is where I would like to revisit this, maybe just by way of illustration, revisit this idea of the circuit of culture from Paul Gay and Stuart Hall. It's a classic and an older model, but I think it helps us understand and explain the complex and interrelated moments and processes involved in the development and maintenance of a social-cultural phenomenon like misinformation. The model helps us to identify the intricate ways in which communication and culture are interlinked through key elements in the communication process, namely representation, identity, production, consumption, and regulation. And so it assumes that texts, and in our case, false information, false texts that are circulating around COVID-19 and other topics of misinformation, those texts are constructed by, but they also help construct the social cultural environment. So they're mutually constitutive. And even in today's media saturated, fragmented, individualized media environment, I would think this model can help to explain how misinformation travels, how it is consumed, how it is amplified or restrained in relation to a range of cultural factors. And I think this is why it's useful to revisit this sort of classic model. So let's just look at the first element there, the element of representation. Representation refers to the content of a message, the language, science, connotations of particular elements of the text. So it assumes that texts are sites of struggle, where meanings are contested, counter meanings are produced, and messages are encoded and decoded in relation to their environments. So what does this mean? Say, for instance, there is a message constructed by health authorities in a technical manner to explain how masks prevent the spread of the virus. That is the coding of the message that is sent out in a public health communication. But audiences, for some reason, how they are positioned in their environment and their political discourse, decode that message as an attack on their liberty. If there's a slippage, in other words, in that meaning, the coding as a sort of technical coding, a health message, but a decoding of it as a political message. And there's a slippage of that meaning. And I think that is in that slippage that misinformation can insert itself. I think this is also where some of the customized messages targeted at people's value systems that Dr. Saad Omer earlier talked about. I think that's, for me, it was a very interesting intervention to explore because I think it builds on this idea. So that is the element of representation. I think we have to take seriously, and there are lots of work that we can do around that. But we have to understand those representation strategies culturally, I think, because that will help us understand to distinguish how misinformation is constructed in a way so as to appeal to people's emotions, appeals to people's fears and anxieties, and also which political discourses they resonate with. So do they resonate with a libertarian discourse or an individualist discourse, or with a communitarian one, etc. So that leads us also to the second element, and that's the element of identity. So I think identity is also very important when we consider why people share misinformation and why they're also maybe more inclined to believe misinformation. And some of these reasons I think we've heard today and yesterday. Some reasons might be that this gives them a sense of belonging to a particular community. It makes them feel seen when people laugh at their jokes, etc. And some of the studies that we've also heard earlier today points to political affiliation, age demographic, and other identity positions that gives us clues as to why people share misinformation. Third element, that of production, has been studied quite extensively. We know that the massive changes in the digital media ecology has blurred the lines between production and consumption of information. So media audiences are maybe now more accurately described as media users. And cultural studies has never seen audiences as completely passive. They've always seen them as actively decoding and making meaning. But in this new parody and remix culture of the web, we know that there are misinformation spreads very rapidly. People curate them, those messages, people reshape them, and they use them within these echo chambers or filter bubbles that we've also heard about. So I think when we deal with the infodemic and try to find ways to counter it, we also have to keep the context of production very clearly in mind. The fourth element, that of consumption, again, I think it's much less easily distinguishable from the moment of production than it was in the time of the Sony Walkman when this study was designed. But consumers have always, as I said, been active participants in meaning making from this perspective of cultural studies. And it means that they don't only receive information, but they shape it, they curate and share it. So from the literature that we've seen around misinformation and from our own studies, we see that there's a very high percentage of people that admit to sharing misinformation knowingly. And our own research has shown, for instance, that this percentage is much higher in African countries than, for instance, in the US. And that is quite an alarming figure. We look at those figures, 29% of Kenyans, 18% of Nigerians, 25% of South Africans say that they have shared information that they knew at the time was not true. And that prompts us then to ask why. Why do social media users share this misinformation knowingly? We can only answer that question from the perspective of people's lived experience, their context, and I think this is where this is important, this consumption. A related issue to consumption is that of trust. We've heard some of that again today. And I think in contexts like in the African context, there's been a long history of a lack of trust in official sources of information for good reason. Many media are state-owned. The legacy of colonial media and later post-colonial state-owned media has for a long time turned people to what Stephen Ellis has referred to pavement radio. In other words, that this informal circuits of gossip, jokes, and humor are more authoritative or seen as more trustworthy than authoritative sources of authority. And I think those consumption habits, those lack of trust in mainstream narratives still play a role. We've seen recently studies that have come out of the Reuters Institute, for instance, that there's been a huge surge in media consumption during the COVID-19 pandemic. Audiences have sought reliable information. So there's a huge uptake of news media, but still overall levels of trust in the media seem to be at the lowest point ever. Fewer than 4 in 10 people surveyed by the Reuters Institute this year as the pandemic hit said that they trust most news media most of the time, and less than half say they trust the news that they themselves use. In markets like my own, South Africa, trust in news media is slightly higher, but again, those surveys tend to target urban dwellers that have access to the internet, and we don't know really what the picture is in the broader society. So within this COVID crisis, as people have turned to media, maybe paradoxically so, they've also been exposed to information overload and a lot of noise. And that might have also led to the erosion of trust, or at least to the inability to make informed decisions. So again, that survey of the Reuters Institute indicate that a high number of people don't know what media is real and what is fake. Our own research has also seen that people are, when we look at the perceived exposure, when you ask people, do they think they've been exposed to made up or inaccurate political news stories? The number of people who say yes are also the people who are likely to spend a lot of time reading online news and reading newspapers. So there's that paradox. So this overload has already for some time given rise to increased confusion, cynicism, fragmentation of communities with very little consensus around facts. And of course, that is a really serious problem when we deal with important information, like in the context of the coronavirus. I think in the context of the current pandemic, what we've also seen is that there have been a number of contradictory and speculative reports about treatments and vaccines, also from mainstream media. And that has eroded this, this trust further and have intensified these trends. So I think these two elements, trust and motivations, how people trust, to what extent do they trust the media and authoritative narratives, and to what extent are they motivated to share misinformation and why? Those two elements are really key, I think, to a sort of media and cultural studies approach to try and understand what is happening and how can we intervene. So that last element of regulation, I think there's been a lot of discussion around that, appropriate responses, different types of responses. But I think, again, regulation in some countries like in South Africa and Brazil attempts to criminalize misinformation is one attempt that we've seen recently in this specific current environment. And again, I think that's highly problematic, and it also maps on histories within these countries of resistance and of repression of free media. So I'll return to some of those motivations and responses shortly. So if we can maybe go to the next slide there of motivations. I think what is important to understand from a sort of media and cultural studies approach, and where this model might be helpful, is to see these elements as interlinked. But if we focus on motivations, we've also heard Dr. Beckman speak about some of the social values that motivate sharing, such as social desirability. Some of the other reasons that we've seen in the literature is financial and political gain. That might be one of the motivations. People have reported in other studies that they share misinformation to express their feelings, to inform others, to find out what other people think. Yet another study has shown that people say they do this to cope with uncertainty, to build relationships, for self-enhancement, social cohesion, markers of mutuality. All of these motivations, I think, are really interesting because they speak to where people are positioned within their cultural environment, within their own specific social context, and it also speaks about the media ecosystem within which they find themselves. So if we can go to the following slide there of our own research, the motivations that we've done. So I've been involved in the last few years around research, survey research, as well as focus group research we've now covered 6 African countries, and we're still at the moment crunching some of the data that has just emerged from a new round of surveys. And some of the findings that we find in these African countries is that some of these motivations are similar. We see some of the same motivations that I've just mentioned in previous studies, but there are also some important differences. And I think these differences speak to the context and to the social and political history of these countries. So for instance, what we found is that the type of story influences shareability. Topics about health and food, scams, safety, terrorism. These are stories that are more likely to be shared than news about politics. And we can speculate about those reasons. But I think they have to do with some of the other motivations that we also see. So for instance, the most common reason that we found is that people say that they want to raise awareness. So this is a sense of civic duty almost, that they say they want to let other people know that there is this danger. And even if they know that this might be wrong, or they know that this information might be false, they do so in any case, just to be safe. They do this out of this sort of sense of community and conviviality, maybe. And again, I think that is an important characteristic of these societies. The second reason is related, but it's not only to raise awareness of an issue, but it is to raise awareness of misinformation itself. To say that, look at this information that I found, this is clearly nonsense, and to shame that lack of veracity. But again, even if people do this in order to make other people aware of this rumor or this misinformation that is circulating, of course, that contributes to its spread. The third reason that we found in these countries, and this is where I think I would like to refer back to that notion of joking and of humor and satire. And the third reason is in these sub-Saharan countries, that I think this is where it differs from the global north, is that people say that they share misinformation for fun. They do so just to distract themselves from the other challenges that they're facing, from the other problems that they have to deal with, or to make light of this new problem that they don't know how to deal with, and that they maybe feel anxious about and feel threatened by. So humor, gossip, and satire seem to be a refuge for media users overwhelmed with serious or depressing news. also to create conviviality and community. Again, I think characteristics of the communities and the countries within which we have done these surveys. So I think it's these contextual differences between the different motivations to share misinformation that emphasize the importance of considering these practices as social cultural phenomena. And I think once we've done that, once we've seen this is a social cultural phenomenon, we can evaluate what type of responses might be most appropriate for a particular context, rather than trying to administer a panacea or a one-size-fits-all vaccine, again, to return to the medical metaphors. So if we can just look at the next slide briefly there, what I've done there is just to share some of the responses that we've seen. I don't have to go into that in too much detail. This is, again, well documented, I think, in literature, but some of the responses, credibility signaling that we've seen by mainstream news organizations. Again, now I think in the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen many a new surge of readers going to these credible news organizations, despite the lack of trust, etc., that I've already mentioned. But ironically so, of course, what we see is also the demise of smaller independent outlets, huge economic pressure on newspapers, especially magazines. In my own country, some of them have already had to close down, and we've seen that around the world. So this, of course, creates higher conglomeration, less diversity of voices, more clickbaiting, and so there's, again, a problem with this. Platform responses that we've seen, WhatsApp's limiting of forward, for the number of forwards that you can do, fact labeling, we've seen Twitter fact-checking President Trump's statements. These are all things, I think, that have been mentioned and that are documented, and we have to look at which of these are most appropriate for a specific context. So public authority responses, calls for stronger regulation, laws. I've mentioned the criminalization in some countries of misinformation that has around COVID-19 has come to the fore and is problematic because it taps into other political imperatives that might be used as a smokescreen. Observational correction, being corrected by other users, that I think is an interesting example, especially, or an interesting response, especially when you think about the way that these corrections might be targeted or might be customized by people that know the language, literally and figuratively, of other users. Media literacy campaigns and fact-checking organizations, I think many of these efforts are very good as firefighting, where there are particular flare-ups or cases, again, to use the language of epidemiology. So when there's a flare-up or where there's a specific bit of misinformation that arises, these fact-checking and these literacy campaigns, I think, can be very useful, but they tend to be top-down, and they tend to be specific to a specific case, and that they don't necessarily change the broader culture of misinformation, the broader culture of media usage that lead to this problem. So I think what we need is more research-led efforts rooted in a growing understanding of the social and cultural determinants of misinformation. We need to see infodemiology as a pandemic that will not go away. There's no quick cure for this. There's no quick vaccine. It is a problem that we will have to live with on an ongoing basis. And so we'll have to engage with misinformation at a deep social level by immersing ourselves ethnographically, and not think that just merely trying to douse these fires with more facts will have a lasting effect. So the last slide there on recommendations, how do we respond to the crisis in ways that are informed by the sort of a social cultural approach that I've tried to advocate for? Social surveillance. I think when we talk about social surveillance in the context of social media, immediately this raises the specter of big data and of surveillance of users. I think we need to think this in a different way. We have to think of this in a more careful, difficult, long-term listening. We have to immerse ourselves in this context and understand why people are responding in certain ways. What are the anxieties? What are the fears? try to detect the spikes in information, detect the shifts in attitudes and perception, and understand the environment and then respond appropriately. Containment, yes. Fact-checking, yes. Fight these fires, these flare-ups, but also a longer-term approaches to empower online communities to self-correct, to not shame them in the way I think Claire Wardle yesterday spoke also about the danger of shaming people when you correct misinformation, but rather empower communities to self-correct. Mitigation, to support authoritative sources of news, which means investing in good news media, ensuring good media diversity, strengthening community media that speak people's languages. And again, in the South, in the African context, indigenous language media is something that's really important. And also encourage participatory media making. Again, these are longer term efforts that need to build trust. It's not a quick vaccine, it's not a quick fix, it's not a quick treatment, it is a longer term behavioral change and a circumstantial change. And that brings us to behavioral change. I think this is not, we cannot just expect change on the part of media users. We also need to expect change on the part of authoritative communicators, such as the news media, that need to build stronger rapport with their communities, that need to listen better. We need behavioral change of science communicators that need to understand what fears and anxieties they have to speak to, what the relevant language and register is, and also how they can build knowledge, participatory knowledge building with communities, and not only a top-down type of communication that might go amiss when people have lack of trust in authoritative sources. And lastly, I think research, support misinformation research that is rooted in this sort of ethnographic listening. And that might take a longer time, might be more expensive, might be not immediately have a clear payoff, but in the longer run, I think will help us understand these contexts better. So in closing, I think what I would like to advocate for is that we approach the infodemic as a multi-leveled, complex and evolving socio-cultural phenomenon and not merely as a technological one. It's an infodemic that is ongoing. We need not only a quick fix, but something that will last. And that's why I think we need to take culture, identity, and context seriously. And I think media and cultural studies can offer some useful ways of doing this. Thank you very much for listening.